But there were some mortgages that the government wouldn't co-sign. These were the ones known as the subprime mortgages. But Wall Street figured out that, well, we can securitize these mortgages. The government won't guarantee them, but we're going to buy them all up and put them into these structured products. And by structuring them like this, we're going to reduce the risk. And it was crazy, but something like, after they sliced and diced them, better than 2/3 of these subprime mortgages. And these are mortgages where people put nothing down, have lousy FICO scores, don't have jobs, are in prison, whatever it was. These mortgages, 2/3 of them are rated AAA. AAA. I mean, how can that be? I said, how can you take all these lousy mortgages and they're rated AAA? Well, I mean, but it was because Wall Street was able to securitize all these bonds and sell them to the Japanese and sell them to the Chinese and sell them to the hedge funds that there was demand. And of course, you know, why was there so much demand for high yielding assets? Because the Fed had interest rates too low. Everybody needed yield and they were willing to take risks to get it. And where did all these foreign central banks get all this money that they recycled back into these bonds? Because of our trade deficits, because rates were too low. So you had the government perpetuating this crisis, and you had the attitude that, you know, that real estate prices couldn't fall. I mean, I remember I had a booth in Phoenix, Arizona, at an investment conference. This is probably back in 2004, 2005. There was a guy right in a booth next to me, and he had a real estate company. And what this guy did was he put people together who had lousy credit and who couldn't buy homes with people who had good credit. And the people with good credit co-signed the loans for the people with lousy credit. And therefore, everybody, you know, now this guy with bad credit can get a house. And the other guy got some extra payments, whatever it was. But there was one flaw in his whole argument. And I said to him, well, what if the guy, this deadbeat person that can't get a loan, but your client is co-signing, what if that guy doesn't pay? What happens to your client? Then you lose money. I said, well, then we just sell the house. I said, okay, but what if the house goes down? And he looked at me like I was from Mars. He said, this is Phoenix. He says, real estate prices don't go down in Phoenix. And, you know, and I imagine how many people lost a ton of money now, because that's probably one of the worst housing markets in the country. But this kind of stuff. So Wall Street, everybody had this idea that housing prices couldn't go down. So nobody questioned these AAA ratings. It didn't matter, because if somebody defaulted, you had the house to sell. But I knew that housing prices were going to fall. I mean, I remember when I would go on television and talk about housing prices falling, and people would say, well, that's not going to happen. That hasn't happened since the Great Depression. That's impossible. But people would ignore everything that had happened in the last 5 years. They would see, here was housing prices. They was like this. Then they went straight up. And said, well, they can't, because they've never fallen, they can't fall. I said, but they've never done this. How are they going to stay up here? You know, they were saying it was like a permanent plateau. You know? And I said, look, there's no way. And of course, everybody now, in hindsight, everybody wants to criticize the lax lending standards, the lack of a down payment. Everybody knows all these things that we did wrong, right? That we had too many people buying houses and credit was too cheap. So everybody can agree that we need to go back to a prudent form of lending. But nobody wants to go back to prudent pricing. Everybody wants to go back to sound lending principles, but leave the bubble prices intact. That's impossible. How can we? Nobody can afford to pay these high home prices without these gimmicks. But the reality is, of course, you know, the best thing that can happen to the real estate market is that prices come down. You know, it used to be that the mission of Freddie Fannie, before, you know, they went broke, was to try to make home ownership affordable. Now their mission is to keep home prices high, to keep homes unaffordable, to make sure that we have to mortgage ourselves, you know, to the hilt to buy a house. The government solution is high prices but low mortgage payments subsidized by the government. The free market solution is low prices. Because if real estate prices go down, you don't need to borrow that much money to buy a house. So it doesn't matter that your mortgage payment is a little higher. But, you know, the government still looks at the problem that home prices are falling. That's the solution. The problem is that they went up. So the problem, and the real problem that we have, of course, is now that the bubble has burst, you know, first in the stock market, now the real estate market, and now that we're having this massive recession, which is just getting started, I mean, we've barely gotten a taste of it. But unfortunately, all the blame is on the free market. All the blame is on capitalism. It's because there wasn't enough regulation. There was too much greed, right? And, you know, President Bush, in one of his speeches, said that Wall Street got drunk. And he was right. They were drunk. So was Main Street. The whole country was drunk. But what he doesn't point out is where they get the alcohol. Why were they drunk? You know, obviously, Greenspan poured the alcohol. The Fed got everybody drunk. And the government helped out with their moral hazards and the tax codes and all the incentives and disincentives they put in, all the various ways that they interfered with the free market and removed